Thank you, Vivian, very much indeed for your leadership in this project and your inspiration in thinking about how to organise the day. And we are immensely grateful too to the British Academy, the British Academy Rising Star Engagement Awards for funding the day. My thanks too to the Royal Society of Medicine for their partnership in an ongoing way in our work. My title for today, which before over coffee somebody described as rather enigmatic, is Profit for All or Forfeiting Healthcare's Soul. What I want to focus on at the start of the day then is the soul of healthcare, and especially the influences on the soul which come from private, especially profit-making involvements in healthcare. So we talk about the soul in our ordinary language. We might say the movement has lost its soul. He was a soulless leader, or she was the life and soul of the department. By soul, I mean a person's life energy, their life force, you might say. In particular, in our context today, I mean soul or life force as invested in health, whether that's one's own health or the health of others. So the soul of healthcare, for the purposes today, is the souls of the persons participating in healthcare, whether that's patients or practitioners or managers, commissioners, policymakers, taxpayers, and so on. The soul is traditionally an aspect of moral psychology and indeed metaphysics. Moral psychology has to do in large part with how reasoning and motivation processes operate in human agents. So we may hear, I hope we will hear later from Dr. Quigley, the way that thinking about reasoning and motivation processes has shaped interventions in public services, especially via choice architecture and behavioural economics. In the Hebrew metaphysics, which has shaped my own discipline of moral theology, soul is conceived in relation to heart and mind. If soul is life force, then heart and mind are mutually interwoven life orientation and life intelligence. I think this way of thinking actually fits our ordinary language usage quite well when we talk about the soul. Because when we say the department has lost its soul, or this is a soulless institution, we mean not just life energy, but the intelligent orientation of that energy. So forfeiting the soul of healthcare will mean soul's orientation being distorted and soul's intelligence being clouded in some way. A soul's forfeiture has to do with following a different direction than one which will make for the flourishing of the person and the community of persons. Soul can be, at least I think it has historically been, a relational phenomenon for Christian moral theology, just as person has historically been a relational concept. So the interrelation of soul, heart and mind is basic to the meaning of a human life. Consider this, I think, intuitively attractive claim. In the National Health Service, both professionals and patients find meaning precisely in the fact that service is rendered to those in need of healthcare. The question for today is whether this service meaning is wholly or even merely probabilistically, and that's an important qualification I think, merely probabilistically incompatible with the kinds of influences and thought patterns which characterise markets, where profit is a goal in addition to service. Service must have a purpose, and I think this must include the outcomes for patients. Service can't simply be good intentions, service must also be effective. But how does one achieve good value outcomes? How does one do so in a way which doesn't disrupt or destroy that spirit of service upon which healthcare depends? What arrangement of private and public, if any, will yield the kind of service which is able to operate within budget, improve health outcomes, and provide real public benefit? Harvard Business School's Michael Porter, a somewhat controversial figure, I think, he's a market-based thinker on healthcare. He's argued that the, quote, only way to truly contain costs in healthcare is to improve outcomes. There was a conference in January 2014 responding to Michael Porter's work, and there one person said that, quote, access, compassion, and involvement are easily squeezed out of a competitive outcomes-based process. The US offers a sad demonstration, as Michael Porter himself knows, of how, in his words, high-value care is difficult to achieve when people lack access to primary and preventive care. So what public benefit could really be served by an arrangement in which compassion is squeezed out and access is under threat? And yet a focus on outcomes and long-term value for patients rather than solely on short-term costs may be able to incorporate a creative, disciplined use of competitive and non-competitive procurement processes which sustain ethos and access. Catherine Mountford and her colleagues at the Oxfordshire Clinical Commissioning Group will be leading a workshop on how they've approached this very issue later today. And as I perceive it, such creativity flourishes precisely because of its decentralised, localised, place-specific nature. So I've suggested that service is a core source of meaning to the souls participating in healthcare. That service, or perhaps to use an older word, vocation, comes with demanding constraints of various kinds, both financial and political. And I've asked whether the meaning people find in service is necessarily distorted and clouded by the presence of market forces. To state the questions in a slightly different way, can an eye for profit and an eye for good healthcare be together in the face-to-face encounter, which is the relationship between patient and practitioner? Or again, should the sight of both provider and payer be undivided, undistracted by the profit motive when health is in view? And in any case, perhaps to pick up a theme from later in the day, will profit-making in healthcare lead inevitably to the commodification of health and the dissolving of that solidarity among persons which makes for a humane political society? Will assigning a market price to the time and expertise needed to care for the sick entail a diminution or even extinction of the meaning which healthcare's soul needs in order to have the strength to live and effectively face the demands of value and outcome for patients? And then will trust, that precious life-giving bond which healthcare has just about managed to keep, despite everything, be the casualty of such a movement? So let me back up for a moment and comment on why meaning is important to those working in healthcare. As Bill Fulford, who's here today, and others have observed, the shift towards values-based practice in recent years has rightly involved a greater awareness of how the medicine of the person, in Paul Tournier's evocative phrase, focuses not only on the patient, but also on the professional as a person. Two recent BMJ articles have developed this theme in different directions. First, there's a 2009 article by Alec Morton and Jocelyn Cornwell from the Point of Care Foundation, and they explore the legitimacy of comparisons between healthcare institutions and corporations. They specifically focused in an entertaining way on bottling factories. They observe to use their words, fundamental fact about hospitals. They are settings for some of the most important events in people's lives, for times of both greatest joy and greatest loss. The customers, I think they use the word ironically, in hospitals are routinely asked to undress. Some are unconscious, most feel vulnerable, and many are distressed or fearful. They inspire strong emotions in staff, compassion, pity, admiration, or sometimes contempt. And then they continue with the quote on the slide there, the organised religions are perhaps the only candidate organisations that routinely touch so closely the raw fundamentals of human experience. As they do with religious figures, patients expect personal authenticity and engagement from their healthcare providers and can sense the disaffection and cynicism that over-reliance on extrinsic motivators such as financial and performance targets can generate. So what Morton and Cornwell are observing is that organised religion and healthcare institutions concentrate attention on meaning in human life. They worry about the effect of an over-reliance on extrinsic motivators, on such a delicate environment. Now that phrase over-reliance, of course, suggests that some reliance on extrinsic motivators, whether targets or incentives, financial or otherwise, might actually be beneficial or at least neutral for such an environment. Second, more recently, there was a widely discussed, no doubt we've all read it, BMJ article by John Dean entitled "Private Practice is Unethical and Doctors Should Give It Up." I imagine everyone's had a look at this. He was worried about the distortion of his medical vocation and the destruction of the NHS because of his and others' involvement in private practice. He described himself as sitting atop a pile of money, but then renouncing the means used to gain that money as iniquitous, while recognising the possible, in fact inevitable, charge of hypocrisy. Now, whatever you thought of his argument, and I think it's fair to say that many engaged in private practice have found it deeply misleading and offensive, if the letters in the BMJ are anything to go by, what struck me were the deep moral questions about vocation, about how people feel about their professional identity, how they spend their lives, that arose from the article. In short, that sense of meaningfulness. It is probable that many doctors, is it probable that many doctors will look back on their lives as involving, in some sense, a forfeiting of their soul, their life force, their intelligence, their orientation, to some lesser purpose than that for which they set out? Might healthcare practitioners participating in private profit-making healthcare reasonably worry they've entered some kind of Faustian pact, incompatible with the social contract of medicine and their calling of service to patients? Now, these questions must also be examined not only via the patient perspective, but also that of the wider citizen body, most of whom will themselves be patients at one point. How is that meaningfulness of the patient experience and citizenship itself shaped by the role of different financial structures at work in the NHS? So I think what these two articles illustrate is a worry about the forfeiture of healthcare's soul amidst political and financial pressures. For John Dean in his refurbished kitchen and with his well-educated children, these pressures can be usefully considered by a good old word, temptation. Temptations to do harm arise, in many cases, where goods seemingly conflict. One's children's private education versus good patient care, in John Dean's case. Giving in to temptation eats away at the trust relationship that exists between healthcare practitioner and patient. Giving in to temptation brings impoverishment to the rich meaning of the social covenant of solidarity, which is said to lie in a publicly funded healthcare service accessible to all, in which citizens jointly participate, sometimes as taxpayers and healthcare professionals, at other times being served by those same people. Inasmuch as solidarity is a social and political phenomenon, it has to do with citizenship and participation, with fields such as political thought, history, political science. Inasmuch as the rationale for solidarity requires some kind of grounding, it has to do with belief and commitment, with fields such as philosophy and theology. So I leave detailed questions about the organisation of institutions and contracts to other contributors. I expect to learn far more from them today than I could possibly offer. I note in passing, though, that many of the features of institutional design actually do relate to the questions of soul, of heart and mind, which I've been mentioning, these terms of traditional Hebrew and Christian thought. And this is especially the case as they deal with questions of emotions or affectivity. The main point for now, though, is that institutional questions should be connected to these questions of meaning, of service. And that is one way of getting some purchase on the interrelation between humanities, social sciences and medical sciences, which the British Academy is so generously funding in this project. So my question is whether everyone can profit from private involvement in healthcare without the necessary or even the probable loss of what I've called healthcare's soul. Can heart and mind be so intelligently oriented that markets enable rather than undermine both professional vocation to serve and patient responsibility to participate in good health outcomes? Can the spirit of service, which characterises the best of the NHS, find renewal, focus and effectiveness through the endeavours of private enterprise? So these are questions which cause public, political and professional anxiety. There is a risk of deep damage to morale, to the values by which the soul of healthcare gains its orientation and intelligence. And this is a worry not just for healthcare professionals, but for all citizens. What is it to be a humane political community is the question I raised earlier. Will even very carefully commissioned private profit-making enterprise conflict with such a vision just because privatisation necessarily and always introduces unworthy or immoral motives which will distort even the best intentioned private enterprise and thereby undermine the solidarity which is at the core of service and meaning? Healthcare should, some would say, stand against the cultural commodification and false political philosophy of the market. To return then to the theme of temptation, different sorts of temptation need to be scrutinised. Most obviously, they may surround how to understand the motive to make a profit and spend that profit on goods essentially extrinsic to healthcare, such as new kitchens or for children's education. But there are also professional motives which need scrutinising. The latter may have regard in a less than self-critical way to the sense of self which pertains to a professional identity. That healthcare professionals have a unique and privileged perspective on service which must be defended against the rapacious market. This could, in fact, be self-deceiving, of course, and much focus has recently fallen on conflicts of interests, especially among general practitioners commissioning services. Kate Adlington and her team are doing very interesting work on financial interests more generally, and you'll hear more from them if you're part of their workshop later on. But a kind of temptation quite different from personal self-enrichment is despair at the possibility of improvement and innovation, the seeming impossibility of caring for an ageing society with limited or dwindling resources. And that too is a temptation to which people should not be systematically exposed. The task is to scrutinise how certain kinds of arrangements, such as the commissioning of health services through private enterprise and the promise, or perhaps hype, of industry-led personalised medicine, stand in relation to those temptations. And Johann Christian Poder, who will be speaking later on, has been looking at personalised medicine and the hype and the hope of that in a German context. So he may have more to say about that later, or you can ask him over coffee. Now this brings me to the theme of trust and its relation to markets and profit. In trust, the souls of people participating in healthcare can join, sharing in common concern, that depth of intensity to which Morton and Cornwell alluded. John Dean, remorseful over the impact of his private practice on patients, claimed that, quote, "the inescapable fact is that money was at the root of it all." His thought is that money, in the end, drove a wedge between himself and his patients, encouraging deceit, providing perverse incentives, corrupting his practice, undermining the service the NHS provides. Now his comment, though poignant, is, I think, misses a dimension to which the wisdom of the early Christian church is more alert. You see the quotation there from the Apostle Paul, that it's the love of money which is the root of many kinds of evil, the love of money, that love which corruptly values a patient's well-being at a lesser level than my luxury, that love of money which is at the root of distrust. This is what John Dean is surely concerned about for himself and for others. Now, trust is important because of the weight of meaning that the relationship between patient, policymaker, healthcare practitioner and taxpayer must bear. At its best, healthcare provides a sense of being loved in a relationship of promise, perhaps a contract or a covenant. In the soul of many, perhaps most healthcare practitioners, is that intelligent orientation to provide continuous, outcome-focused, long-term care to a population. The idea of a relationship being of long duration, organised and loving, bespeaks the notion of a promise or covenant. And this covenant gives stability to the souls of citizens who, being confident about the availability and the ethos of healthcare, can pursue their work, family life and projects with relative confidence. And interior to the flourishing of the covenant is trust, the trust which subsists between the parties to the covenant. On that trust, people can build their lives with intelligent orientation and long-term planning. Whether or not such long-lasting, continuous, joined-up care is, can work well with profit-making private enterprises is a crucial question. And a crucial question especially for the materially poorest. And that's a theme which John Took and others have focused on recently in The Lancet in an important article about personalised medicine. So love of money can severely add to a disruption to trust, both on a personal and societal scale. People in loving money may be tempted to see persons, and especially personal suffering, as opportunities for amassing capital, to apply the sign system of sterling, dollar or euro, which is meant for inanimate objects, to persons who are animate, those who have personal souls. A temptation to pick low-hanging fruit rather than what makes for long-term fruitful lives. Rather than love of money, the eyes should be on seeking value for patients, both in terms of costs and outcomes, which make for better health in the longer term. And yet, acceding to such a corrupted love is not a cosmically necessary way of viewing persons when engaged in private enterprise. There is money on the one hand, and there is the love of money on the other. One a sign system for value, the other a matter of moral psychology. The parable of the Good Samaritan is the symbol of this British Academy funded project. The Good Samaritan's effectiveness in enabling care was conditional upon his soul, heart, mind attitude to the injured person. But it was also conditional on him having money with which to pay the innkeeper, to exercise hospitality to the injured person, and on there being an innkeeper to pay. The Good Samaritan's goodness was conditional upon his not loving his money, lest he fail to be at service to the injured person. And in fact, we know nothing of the innkeeper, except that he is expected to have kept faith with the Samaritan, a trust held together in part by the transfer of funds and the promise of more funds. Trust, too, is of course a feature of the marketplace. Businesses can build trust through the reliable conveyance of goods and services, and this too can contribute to the stable basis on which people's lives depend. But it is when business and healthcare come together that concerns are typically raised. Circle is an interesting case. Their clinics, if you watch their promotional videos, like the innkeeper perhaps, promise to provide fresh food, locally sourced, to patients who attend for a highly circumscribed set of treatments. It has hardly been plain sailing for Circle, as we'll know, although their dealings with Hinchinbrook Hospital do not seem to have involved fault on just one side. But more recently, there are now significant problems too with their enterprise in dermatology in the Nottingham area, and that was picked up again in the BMJ recently. The key for trust must be to do with the profession being focused on outcomes for patients, on care having a teleological, long-term orientation towards better health. The question then is whether there can be a market-based system which aligns sufficient profit for private enterprise with improved citizen behaviour, better health outcomes, and less use of the health service. This seems crucial to the design of contracts openly tendered to private enterprise. Would it be desirable that contracts for, say, community care be made over a 7 or even 10-year period and linked to rewards to the number of acute admissions or treatments? Such contracts would need to deal with the risks that private providers might actively discourage admissions for patients who need it. Strict contractual obligations would have to deal with this. But with this in mind, perhaps it's the case that no contract could sufficiently safeguard patient welfare. The viability of such a contract would seem to rely heavily upon the leadership and moral excellence of the private enterprise involved. I look for others who are far more expert in the design of contracts to correct me or pick me up or give me much more nuance on those remarks. So what's at stake are patient outcomes, but with the risk of forfeiture of the soul of meaning. Trust depends on service. Trust is that which unites souls in shared and meaningful participation in healthcare. Exposing trust to risk can only be worthwhile where there is real profit for all, rather than the vindication of any one ideological commitment, whether that's to cleaning markets out of healthcare or believing that market processes alone will deliver healthcare from its current ills. So with all this said, human life is risky. While the presence of profit-making possibilities and the asymmetries of information and known benefit do involve real risk, minimising or eliminating the role of private provision in healthcare is also risky if it diminishes efficiencies or advances in quality and moral insight. What are the risks to trust attendant on a health service which is not reformed because of a risk-averse culture, whether in government, management, or in the healthcare professions themselves? What is a reasonable shared participation in risk by professionals, commissioners, patients, the general citizenry, or indeed government? What elements of what kinds of private provision introduce risk in an unacceptable manner or on a scale which is likely to damage trust irretrievably? Let me make two, I hope, constructive observations as I close. Greater Manchester is at the heart of a significant public services experiment with the Westminster government's planned devolution of public service budgets and possibly some tax-raising powers to local bodies. One of the recommendations of the think tank Res Publica and its publication there, Devo Mank, was to promote with due caution the role of small-scale private enterprises, commissioned because of their evident commitment to place and locality rather than simply on price. The proper target of the critique of private services on this reckoning is not private provision per se, but rather the difficulties of scale and commissioning in sustaining local participation. So can private enterprise be geared to focus on preventive, predictive, participative and personalised healthcare, especially on a local level, and thus sharpen up the public services we need? The answers to these questions, at least in many cases, may well be no. Edmund Pellegrino comments, thinking especially of the US context, that effective prevention requires education and counselling, and these are personnel intensive and rarely profit-making. Close quote. Moreover, it may be that meaningfulness in particular will be crowded out in certain kinds or perhaps all kinds of market relationships as price jostles and tramples on quality and service in a race to make money out of the suffering of souls. However, not all corporations are the same. In fact, I'll particularly highlight initiatives in the US in this respect. One of the most important of these is the development of so-called public benefit companies. It's a new legal form which is now present in 28 of the US states. Such companies have their license to operate and make a profit directly linked to their pursuit of an identified public benefit. There is no similar legal form in the UK, although there is a B Corp certification system operating both here and on the continent, and it's worth having a look at bcorporation.uk in this respect. I've also located one UK health-related company with such certification, and I'd be interested to know if people know about this company, Patients Know Best, and what their reflection is on their work. I note that their chairman is in fact a former editor of the BMJ. We already have the Social Value Act, of course, and groups like the Social Economy Alliance, which point in this social enterprise direction. And I'd be interested to know what those involved in commissioning services think of these developments and how they relate also to developments on the continent. But to return to B Corp, if there were a public benefit legal form in this context, then corporations involved in healthcare would be obvious candidates. Finally, a word on incentivisation, stimulated by Martin Rowland's work on the Advancing Quality Initiative in England's North West region, in which incentivisation payouts were not linked, as I understand it, to personal incomes, but rather to improving clinical care. Effectively, as I understood it, a kind of prize or award was made to a department in a hospital in light of their superior performance on a particular indicator. I'm told by Martin over coffee just now that perhaps the outcome of the process wasn't exactly what was anticipated. Maybe he'll be able to shed more light on this later on. Incentivisation schemes can galvanise and energise orientation and intelligence towards ends which may include personal financial enrichment, but may also exclude or go beyond such enrichment. Christian theology has a long tradition of reflecting on how, if at all, self-love, neighbour love and the love of God might coincide. Self-love is not sufficiently explained by being about self-interest. Instead, it can be about locality and place, about improving clinical care in this hospital which I love, among these patients whom I love, with these colleagues whom I love. Now, we shouldn't take love here as a kind of vague feeling, still less a romanticised one, but rather love as a kind of ordered, determined affectivity, essentially interpersonal or intersubjective in nature, which initiates reasoning processes. Incentivisation schemes which strengthen precisely this ethos in the NHS are humane just because they are localised, like our lives and commitments. The benefit to the individual is in the improved conditions for work, whereby what one wants to do with one's life, that intelligent soul orientation to service, one can do better because of the prior commitment to improving quality, which has in turn yielded additional financial resources. And this accords with at least the first part of that rather bracing saying attributed to Jesus of Nazareth in his parable of the talents. To everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance, but from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Second half is the particularly bracing part. In this developing, localising, or perhaps fragmenting healthcare scene, there is an urgent need for ongoing conversation about the soul of healthcare. Moreover, there's an opportunity for fresh insights to be gained as localities take somewhat different approaches to the provision of health and social care. It seems to me that CCGs can be key foci for thinking about these soulful ethos questions, facilitating developments which contribute to a local and national conversation about what will provide the best value outcomes for patients and a service of real meaning for all. Thank you.